I'm going to record this one. And all the rest of that stuff is optional. Anything that has to do with the election and all that is optional, and you can listen to it if you wish, but this is the important part of the lecture, okay? So let's go ahead now and share the screen with you. And there we go. And this is the screen I was telling you about. I'm going to go ahead and put this in. And when I do that, I'll put the study guide right here, and that will be within the hour, okay? All right, cool. Here's the, by the way, you'll need to do this reading right here. That'll really help you with the study guide. Super, that'll be your third one. Yeah, there you go. So not too many, not too fast. We're doing pretty well. Let's go through now and give you what you need to continue on. Now, we've introduced, and that's all we've done so far, is to give you a big, what we call a 10,000 foot view, an overview of the 5 major periods of history. But we've also tried to show you how they blend together and how things that happened in the ancient past really still impact us today. And we're still doing that. We're going to talk about calendars. We're going to talk about latitude. We're going to talk about longitude. We're going to talk about writing. We're going to, they invented writing here. We're still writing. So it's really important to understand that all histories lived in the present. And even though our modern age is different in fundamental ways than the medieval period, it was born out of the medieval period. It took probably 250 years to leave the medieval period and to get to the modern age. And even at that, in different parts of the world, they became part of the modern age at a slower pace. For example, Spain, 1492, became a modern age country, whereas Japan would take till 1850. They would still be medieval up until 1850. So this happens at different rates of speed in different places. But as far as the West goes, Western Europe, which is the history we're focusing on, the United States, in other words, we're part of that European settlement. They really kind of started early in the Crusades in the 1100s. So 500 years basically before the modern age started, there was an event that happened here, and it was called the Crusades. If you guys remember the maps, you remember that the Muslims had taken over a lot of territory. Half the Christian world had now become Islamic. And the Christian kingdoms were looking like they were getting crunched on both sides, which they kind of were. And so Pope Urban II decided to declare a holy war called the Crusades, and encouraged French knights, mainly at first, and then English knights and German knights and everybody over time, to attack the Holy Land, to attack the Muslims directly. Instead of absorbing an attack and being on defense, go on offense. And they did. 4 great major crusades with limited success, to be quite honest. The First Crusade was somewhat successful in establishing some temporary Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land, but they would soon be swept away. Each crusade after that got less and less effective. But what the important part of the Crusades was for the West, for Western Europe, was not that they took the Holy Land and kept it. They didn't. But what they learned when they weren't fighting. And that was the food's better, the clothing's better, the science and technology is better in the Muslim world. They're an empire. They are trading with India. They're trading with China. They're getting silks from China. They're getting, silver smiths and things like that. They're doing craftsmanship in India, and they're wearing these as jewelry in the Middle East. Pepper, spice, cinnamon, cumin, cloves, garlic, everything you can possibly mention was coming from the East, tea, coffee, and they were trading this. And so the knights who had invaded go, wow, these guys eat better. Their clothes are nicer. They bathe a lot more often. Oh, and they read. They're literate. We're not. They had literally encountered a more advanced culture. And when they went back, they were starving for what they would have considered luxury items. Oriental rugs, silks, spices of all kinds, especially spices. And the number 1 was pepper. Right? Well, there's also something else happening at the same time. In this peninsula called the Iberian Peninsula, and I'm going to go back to this map because I want to point this out. You need to know that this peninsula is called the Iberian Peninsula. You just have to know that. Today, the Iberian Peninsula has 2 major countries in it, Portugal and Spain. But throughout history, it's called the Iberian Peninsula. So don't forget that. On the Iberian Peninsula, you know that the Muslims had taken it over in 711. We've talked about that already. a group of Muslims called the Moors crossed over into Andalusia, and they called it Andalusia, and they took it all over. But they left a couple of Visigothic Christian kingdoms up at the north who began to battle back. And they did so over a 750-year period. Bit by bit by bit, they took the Iberian Peninsula back. And you notice that Portugal was liberated long before, and it was a kingdom. And Portugal was now free to do other things other than fight. The Spanish weren't quite done. In fact, the Spanish weren't Spanish yet. The Spanish, that was the House of Castile and the House of Aragon. These were two like independent little city state, country states. They married and created the modern day Spain. And so Spain was born. Now with this, on the Iberian Peninsula, with the creation of Spain and the creation of Portugal, we get a new invention which is unique to the modern world. And that is nations, countries. Nobody would have seen themselves as part of a country until now, until modern times. Countries are a modern thing. To say, I'm an American, that's only within the last 500 years somebody would say something like that. You'd be part of this empire, or you'd be part of this religious group, or you'd be part of this tribe. To be part of a nation is kind of a new concept. It's a radically new, different concept. Born in Western Europe. It's not an empire, but it's not a city-state either, and it's not just a wide bit area run by some warlord. It's a unique thing where people would call themselves, I'm Spanish, I'm Portuguese, I'm this, I'm that. I mean, here we are. Think how funny this is. You live in Montana, right? I'm an American. 4 feet across the border, I'm Canadian. Like there's a difference. That this is an invention. The invention of nation states is an invention. And it kind of works because it allows these countries to create what we call critical mass, have a big enough population and enough wealth to do big things. Whereas if they were in these little tiny little tiny country states like these, what we call little fiefdoms, if these aren't big enough to do anything, but you unite this whole peninsula, you unite this whole country, you can do some pretty interesting stuff. Now, you can't do the same kinds of trade and things like an empire can do, or can you? The thing that happens in Portugal is that they learn from the Muslims, they learn from the Italians who were in close contact with the Muslims about tools that will help them navigate in the open sea. Tools that were invented by the Greeks in the classical world called the astrolabe, which was perfected by the Muslims in the 8th century. Now we're talking almost 12 centuries later, they're starting to use that tool to figure out latitude and longitude and navigate the open seas. Also, there was an invention that came from China called the magnetic compass that worked its way because of the Muslim holiday, the Hajj. Remember how you travel to Mecca and Medina during the Hajj period? People in Persia would learn about something like the compass, bring it to the Hajj, and people from Spain would visit the Hajj and say, what's that? Oh, it's a compass. Here, you want one? Sure. And they take it back with them. So within a year, new inventions, the windmill was a good example. Windmill was a thing, the Chinese invention. It got picked up by the Muslims. Within a year and a half, they're building windmills in Spain. You ever heard the book Don Quixote with the windmills? You turn the windmills, you turn the grain, all that kind of stuff. So the point is that empires have this huge trade advantage over these nations, but nations, wow, they create some kind of unity that's pretty darn powerful. We'll talk more about the rise of nation states later, but these are the first two. Now, here's the thing. With these new tools, a little country like Portugal, who would never be anything in the world at all, decided that it wanted to get all the good stuff. They wanted the spices, the peppers, the teas, everything from India. And they didn't want to pay the Italians who were buying it from the Muslims who were buying it from Indians. The Indians, of course, were at the beginning of the production line, and they would trade it. Sometimes that would travel by camel up the Arabian Peninsula, across the ocean first, Indian Ocean, then here, and then up to Byzantium. And then it would go to the Italians. And by the time it got to you, it was expensive. Anytime you go through another middleman, there's an extra cost. And traveling over by land just increases the cost exponentially. These guys are saying, why don't we get to the good stuff quit paying an arm and a leg for pepper. Let's work our way down the ocean here of Africa. And somehow they didn't know how big Africa was. They had no idea how extensive it was. So they had to know how to sail in the open sea. If you're in the middle of the ocean, especially at night, you have nothing to guide you. There's no mountain range. There's nothing on the horizon. It's just waves. You might not even know if you're going left, right, up, down, or any which direction. So you have to be able to tell latitude and longitude. Now, how do you figure that out? Well, these are big mathematical problems. And you know the world is divided into 360 degrees, right? 192 is a quarter, then 180 is half, and then you get to 3/4 and you get to full. So 360 degrees. The same thing from the North Pole to the South Pole. It goes from 0 to 90, back to 0, back to 90, back to 0 again, and that's a full circle. You guys know all that. But the thing about it is, when you're in the middle of the ocean, how do you know how far north and south you are, how far east and west? It takes some doing. And two of the early people that were taught how to do this and made it work were Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama. These two are two of the most important people in the history of the world. Because what they did was they managed to set sail in the open sea, learning to use tools that were now ancient, using degrees that were figured out by the Mesopotamians in ancient times, and figure out where they were so they didn't get lost, so they could actually go pick up some goods in India and bring them back in the case of da Gama, or get to the Americas and pick up some sugar and bring it back to Spain. The two voyages, one was in 1492. Christopher Columbus was the failure of the two at the time. At the time, he only found a bunch of Caribbean islands and there wasn't much there at the time. 5 years later, Vasco da Gama got all the way around Africa and sailed to the good stuff, the peppers and the spices. How did he get there? Well, he was trained. He went to school, okay? In Portugal, they had this great king whose nickname now is Prince Henry the Navigator. And he wanted to set up a vast trading Portuguese empire, right? And so he basically set up a school. It's called Estudio Geral, which means general studies. It basically donated a bunch of business buildings, which would turn into the University of Lisbon today. Now, these buildings were open to teach the sciences. And let's hang on with that. I'm going to have to just not take that call. He basically, they taught grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, and more importantly, astronomy, which meant they taught these captains latitude and longitude and how to keep track of that so they could create maps. The Portuguese had a wonderful little ship called the Caravel. It's not very big. I'm going to get this out of the way so you can see it, but it is very seaworthy. And with his, 3 triangular sails, was able to do some good work, especially close to the coast of Africa. The Portuguese spent 100 years mapping the coast of Africa. It had to be depressing to come back after, a long voyage and go further and further down, and it just keeps going. You literally from Portugal have to sail halfway around the world to get to the bottom of Africa to start sailing back up again. So they go pretty much halfway around the world one direction and have to go halfway around the world the other direction to get to this area. Let me decline that. Okay, should have turned that ringer off. But at any rate, so here we have this situation where Vasco da Gama finally completes the voyage. Bartholomew Diaz was the first to find the Cape. Gama came along the next year and sails around and makes a beeline up the African coast to this city in India called Goa. He knew where he was going because they knew from Arab traders. Arab traders were sailing across here like this all the time, bringing all the good stuff to the Arabian Peninsula, sometimes down to this coastline and by caravan route through Mecca and Medina all the way up to the Christian world and to the Italians. But he got there and he had to compete with these Italians. One of the study guide that we dropped, you read his story and how there were pirates and there were mutinies and all sorts of fun stuff. It's a great story, but we had to drop that one just because we're got to move ahead. But when they got to Goa, which is present-day Mumbai, they literally filled a ship full of pepper, and one shipload full of pepper was so cheap there. But when they brought it back to Portugal and sold it, it paid half of the expenses of the government of Portugal for an entire year. 2 ships paid all the expenses of the country for a year. That's how valuable this was. Suddenly, Portugal was going to become filthy rich. And the more the experience they had, they realized that there's currents in the ocean. They go clockwise in the northern hemisphere, counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. Now, this is going to sound a little crude, but it's true. If you flush the toilet in the northern hemisphere, it swirls this way. If you do it in the southern hemisphere, it swirls the other way. Why? Because of the rotation of the Earth. And the hemisphere happens to be in. Okay, yeah, that's what's happening in the ocean. So what they learned is, if you want to get to quicker, if you don't want to spend 3 years going down the coast of Africa to get there, you can go out more into the ocean and catch this current. And this current will whip you along, and then you're going to catch another current that goes the other way. And you're going to go way out in the Atlantic. You're not going to get close to the African coast, and it's going to slingshot you around the Indian Ocean to Goa. Look, here's the thing. You can see how catching these currents is going to make it a lot faster. And also, too, one guy got a little off, got too far out. His name was Amerigo Vespucci. Oh, yeah, America's named after him. Amerigo Vespucci hit this coastline, and he mapped it, keeping track of the latitudes and longitude. And it was so big, he said, look, that's not just an island out there. This is a new continent, guys. And the Portuguese then settled this part of the continent because this was perfect. They could come down and stop here, pick up food, fresh water, food and supplies, and keep going and slingshot their way to India. In your lifetime, we will go to Mars. When we go to Mars, I don't know which country's going to do it, but somebody's going to do it. When we go to Mars, right, the ship is going to literally go to the moon and slingshot its way using the gravitational pull of the moon to slingshot it to Mars to pick up that extra speed. That's exactly what's happening here for the same reasons. It's all gravity and rotation. And so if you're spinning around something, boom, you fling yourself here, and then you come back and hug the coast on the way back and catch this out, and then you go deeper into the Atlantic to get the advantage of the wind blowing you back into Lisbon. So the Portuguese now would establish colonies now all down the coast of Africa in Brazil. This is the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world. It's Brazil, right? And then you've got all of these colonies. Every dot is a trading colony. In China, they've established Macau. In Japan, they traded there too. And these guys were making money hand over fist for about the next 100 years. They were all there was out there. They was the only ones doing it. And they were just making money faster and more than anybody else. This great sailor that pulled it off, Vasco da Gama, is buried. Here's his tomb. And I think it's in Lisbon. Actually, I better check the study guide because I think he's actually died. He died on one of his voyages. What about Spain? Spain would be the next country, but they still had some work to do because they had to take this area of Andalusia away from the Muslims, right? Now they would do that. They win the final battle right here. Actually, it was here. Win the final battle in the spring of 1492. So, hey, Spain, you just cleared the Iberian Peninsula of Muslims. What are you going to do next? And of course, just like if you win the Super Bowl, the answer is go to Disneyland. Where's Disneyland? It's in the Americas. How do we get there? I don't know, but there's this guy named Christopher Columbus who seems to know how. Christopher Columbus had hung around the court of Spain for 8 years, coming and going, trying to convince him of a crazy plan where Spain could beat Portugal to the punch, where Spain could get to India first, to China and to Japan first. Look, he said, what you're doing, going down and mapping the coast of Africa and spending all that time, it's the wrong way. Just go straight across the Atlantic. You're going to be there like that. You're going to be there faster than you can blink. Well, here's the problem with that. He tried to convince the English to do this, the French to do this, and he tried to convince the Portuguese. When he gets to the Portuguese knew their math. When Columbus showed up, they said, okay, so explain your plan. Well, the world's this big, and if you just sail across here, it's going to, and they just looked at him, started laughing. They knew because they'd already sailed halfway around the world, and the world's a sphere, that it was a lot bigger. It was the difference between, say, the size of a basketball and the size of a grapefruit. They laughed him out of the court. You don't even know your math. Get out of here. He goes back to Spain where they didn't do maths so good. They just didn't have the people that knew. And he was able to try to convince them. The problem with why it took so long to convince them, though, was because they still had a war to fight. But once it was over, he was so obnoxious. They hated him. This would be a problem that he'd have. He demanded so much. If I do this for you, and he was an Italian too, so his Spanish wasn't very good. So I'm an Italian. I know better than you do. You let me do this. You fund it. You pay all the expenses, but you label me the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the number one captain you've got, and number one admiral you've got, viceroy and governor of all the lands I discover. I'm in charge. And oh, by the way, I get to keep half the profits, making me the richest man in the world. And I'll share it with you, king and queen. That arrogance didn't go very far. In fact, they dismissed him. The king and queen dismissed him. Said, get out of here. I'm tired of you. But one guy named Luis de Santa Angel said, oh, time out. Not so fast, king and queen, especially the queen. Went to the queen. And he said, what if he's right? What if we can beat the Portuguese to the punch? That would be like awesome. And oh, by the way, it doesn't have to cost us a dime. There's this little city along the coast that kind of hasn't fallen underneath our rule yet. And we can just extort them and say, if you don't provide the ships and the sailors, we're coming after you and collecting all those taxes you haven't been paying. And they did exactly that. And he said, look, here's the result. Either somebody else pays the expenses, he gets there, and we're all rich. And we don't have to honor this commitment. We can tell him, oh, yeah, sure. And come back and just say, nah, which is exactly what happened too, by the way. But what if he just goes off? What if the world is flat and he just sails off the edge of the world? Then we don't have to listen to him anymore. This is a win-win as far as they were concerned. He was the finance minister. The queen said yes. What really got her, though, was the idea that they could expand Christianity. She was the Roman Catholic princess, right? Anyway, point was, this little town now had to provide the ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, the crew, and the two other captains, the Pinzon brothers. And off they went in August. They left a little late in the year. They should have left a lot sooner. But nevertheless, luckily there weren't a lot of hurricanes and whatever. Now notice the ships are quite different from the Portuguese ships, the more square. These are still really small. This was the biggest of the three, the Santa Maria. This is where Columbus would have been. And what it leads to is this. When Columbus and Vasco da Gama are done, they establish trade routes, and more ships every single year dominate that from that time forward. Hundreds of ships the second year would go out. Thousands later. Today, we have these huge container ships. Any one of these containers can carry as much as any one of those little caravels could for the Portuguese. And when you look, this is Amsterdam. Look at that port. Look at where they store the oil that comes in from the oil tankers. Look at just one ship coming in on the Maastricht line. Look how all this equipment to unload those ships. We now have container ships that are bigger than aircraft carriers that can haul. I mean, you know, it's insane what's happened. And all of this started with these two sailors, Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, in their successful voyages. Now, how did they figure out where they were? Have you ever wondered this? Why there are 60 seconds in a minute? Why there's 60 minutes in an hour? Why don't we use base 10? Why are there 24 hours in a day, 12 plus 12? That isn't, why? 12 months in a year, why couldn't there be 10? Couldn't we use a base 10 for this? Wouldn't it be simpler? The problem is ancient Mesopotamia. The ancient Sumerians hit upon the number 60 as a golden number, and it really is. We should probably be using this for other purposes even to this day. It's called sexagesimal. It's known as base 60. A numerical system with 60 at its base, not 10, 60. The ancient Sumerians figured it out in the 3rd century millennium BCE. They were far from primitive people. They passed it on to the ancient Babylonians who perfected it. It's still used in a modified form for measuring times, angles, and geographical coordinates. Today we use GPS, but we still use the minutes, degrees, and seconds that were figured out by the ancient Mesopotamians. 60 has 12 factors, which makes it extremely useful for division, addition, and so on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60. Now, it also parallels the visible world. When you think about it, 12 is one of the factors, 12 lunar months, right? But 60 times 2 times 3 times 6 is 360, and it's 354 lunar days in a year and 365 solar days in a year. So if you kind of split the difference, it's kind of 360, isn't it? So it looks like they're looking at the world and their planet and they're trying to reconcile it all. And the key to it all is 60. You can also divide 60 in half, and it's 30, and put 60 and 30 together and create 90 degrees. And 180 degrees is the circumference of the world, and it's 365 days around the sun. And it all just mathematically makes a whole lot of sense. So here's the time zones. About every 15 degrees is another time zone. There's 24-hour time zones around the world. It's dark half the time on one side and light on the other side, and it shifts by about 15 degrees every single hour as the earth rotates. That's how it works. If you look, why are we counting by 10? Oh, because we have 10 fingers. Well, wait a minute. There's a better way to do it. And this is how you would have done it in ancient Sumeria, in ancient Babylonia, is you'd count the knuckles on each finger with your thumbs. So you take your thumb and you go, you can see this here, this is bad. Wish we were in class. We could do this, can't do, oh, there we go, maybe. Oh, there's the camera. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Let's do it here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 hours in the day. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 more. 2 and 2, 24. 24 hours in a day. And now you know. They would have counted the knuckles. They would have seen that as the magic formula, not the 10 digits themselves. And they also figured out writing, remember? This is the same group that invented writing. We're still writing. We're still writing. This right here, and carved into a mud tablet, is the number 30. Why? Okay, 1, 2, 3, big wedges. They would do cuneiform with these wedge sticks, sharper on one end, narrower on the other, but they're still shaped in a V. And you basically have big, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. 1, 2, 3, and the small end. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's the number 57. So now you know how to count in cuneiform, piece of cake. And cuneiform was figured out in ancient civilization. All the degrees, all the angles, all of that was figured out here. Perfected by the Muslims, perfected by the Greeks. The Greeks figured out how to do the astrolabe and how to make it all work and apply the math. And then that was preserved through medieval times and improved upon by the Muslims, given to Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama by trained scientists who taught them astronomy, and they became great navigators. It's one story. And these 3 little ships, when they set sail, they started something, like we said, worldwide trade. Now, how do you know your longitude? Well, here's how it works. You have to know time and distance. So they would take a long rope and tie knots in it and throw it overboard, right? And so the knots would kind of float out there, and they would count how many knots. And ships count their speed in knots. They still do. They still use that method, certain distance. And then you have to know the time. Now at night, they would have a kid take an hourglass, and every 30 minutes, he'd flip it over and mark it. Okay, so it runs out, it's done, flip it over, flip it over, flip it over. So they know how many hours it took through the night, and then how far they went. And they wouldn't have the rope going out constantly. They would just about once an hour go out and, okay, we're going this fast. All right, cool. And record that. North and south, you would use the what we call a quadrant, right? They had a little simpler. So I think, yeah, here it is. Here's a quadrant. Quadrant is 1/4 of the earth. You can see here's a wedge of the earth, right? So here's the circular part, and here's the core of the earth. All right. Well, look, you take the horizon and you take the North Star and measure the angle, and the angle is figured out along here with just a simple string being hung down. It would tell you precisely how far north or south you are. So now you know how to go east and west, north and south. Yeah. The Muslims actually had simpler devices, like they used this thing called the Isba, which was in the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean is not quite so big or fraught, with danger. But they would take the Polaris, and they were in the northern hemisphere. They take the Southern Cross in the southern hemisphere, and they just measure how many fingers. Isba just means fingers. How many fingers on this line are you north or south? So you know pretty much, okay, well, Mumbai should be about 2.5 fingers. So we're on the right path. Oh, we're too far south. We're 3 fingers south. We better move ourselves up a bit. All right. Well, the voyage of Columbus was an amazing thing. He did 4 trips, 3 ships the first time, 17 the second, half a dozen the next time, and 1 in this final voyage, which crash landed here in Jamaica. Any rate, The first ship, of course, was the trip was the most precarious and the one of historic value. And he started out on this ship, right? Here's an example of it. Another look at this reconstruction. And they went along really well for 6 weeks. The prevailing winds just blew them along. They didn't even know about those currents yet. They were figuring out, oh my goodness. Now, here's the problem for Columbus, right? For Columbus, he was moving faster than he thought he would. And as he measured the distance, he realized if he told the truth to his crew, how far they had gone, they would mutiny. So he lied to them. He kept a different set of books. Oh yeah, we went 100 miles since we left. And it was really like 1,000. They were moving faster because of those currents that he didn't know about. Also too, he had to be very disappointed after weeks of sailing, 6 weeks. He thought he should have been to India by then, or at least, excuse me, the outer islands of Japan. And he was nowhere close. Then they ran into problems called the doldrums. Now, there were 10 days that they were caught in the doldrums, longer than a week. And what the doldrums are is a band across the earth that shifts up and down, depending on the season, where there's no wind. If you're in a sailing vessel in the middle of the ocean and there's no wind, can you imagine how desperate that would make you get? No wonder his crew was near mutiny. What we call this is called the itch zone, okay? The itch. Sailors know it as the doldrums or the itch. It's called the intertropical convergence zone. Intertropical convergence zone, or itch. Okay, it's a belt around the earth extending approximately 5 degrees north and south of the equator, moving with the seasons. Here, the prevailing trade winds of the northern hemisphere blow into the southern trade winds, collide, and the winds die. But it does create a nice little band of clouds that you can see. And they got stuck in that for a while. They were even out there rowing, you know, with the rowboats trying to pull the ships along. And that, of course, that's futile. It's a big ocean. But guess what? Winds picked up finally, and off they went. They were close to mutiny, as I said. If they had any idea how far they were, Columbus was in big trouble. But somebody up in a crow's nest eventually looked out on the horizon and saw a little band of clouds. And every sailor knew what this could be. When there's even a small island, doesn't matter how big it is, there's so much moisture in the tropics that even a little rise will cool the moisture and create clouds. And they'd been seeing seabirds for a few days. Now, if you've ever been on a cruise, seabirds will follow the ships along. I learned why the last cruise I went on was a Disney cruise down the Caribbean, coming out of the American Virgin Islands and heading toward Disney Key. I don't know if you know about that. It's a really cool place. But anyway, as we're going along, the birds are flying along for like days along with the ship. Just, you know, coming off the ship's sides, there's breezes and they keep going. Why? Because the tourists were throwing food at them all the time. So it's like a big feast as they're heading down the coastline. But these seabirds are coming around. And so when they see that thing of clouds, they said, there's land there. And so they headed toward it. And sure enough, there was. And they found a little spit of an island, which they named San Salvador, Holy Savior, on October 12th, 1492. It's somewhere in the Bahamas. Bahamas has thousands of islands, right? We don't know exactly which one it was because they didn't stay because there wasn't much there. It was either Watlings Island or Samana Key. One of those two, they think. This is according to National Geographic a few years ago. When they hit land, they, you know, let's go see what's there. And there were some Arawak Indians living on the island. So that meant there was some water and stuff, and that's important.
3 minutes.
Thank you. And they were trading. They didn't trade. I mean, they just brought some gifts out because they're probably scared to death. You know, who are these people? And they brought out some dried leaves and some some pears that were really dry, you know. In other words, they didn't have much. So that's why Columbus didn't stay. Instead, he set sail and went further south. Now, the leaves that they brought out as a gift was tobacco. And this was the introduction of tobacco to the world, which became a big trade commodity, still is. It's still a multi-billion-dollar industry. The growth and use of tobacco, which I don't recommend to any of you, but still, it becomes a huge product in world history. Let's stop there because this is where we think that island was. It's Samana Key or Watlings Island. We think it was Samana Key. Wasn't much there. but he had discovered America. So there we go. We'll pick up the story next time. All right. Go ahead and jump into the study guide. It's all ready for you. Well, give me about a half an hour.